The mountain man's weathered hands trembled as he stared down at the small face looking up at him with such desperate hope. Sandra Adams stood beside her 6-year-old daughter, Michelle Torres, in the doorway of his isolated cabin, both of them soaked from the relentless autumn rain that had been falling for 3 days straight. The child's question hung in the air like smoke from his dying fire, each word cutting through him deeper than any blade ever had. "Will you be our papa?" Eric Thomas had lived alone on this mountain for 8 years, ever since he'd lost everything that mattered to him in the valley below. He'd built this life of solitude deliberately, constructing walls higher than the peaks that surrounded him. No visitors, no complications, no heartbreak. But now this woman and her daughter stood before him, refugees from a world that had shown them no mercy, and the child's innocent request threatened to shatter every defense he'd carefully erected. The little girl's dark eyes held a wisdom far beyond her years, the kind that comes only from witnessing too much pain too early. Her small hand clutched a worn cloth doll, its faded dress patched and repatched with different scraps of fabric. Sandra's face bore the gaunt look of someone who had been running on empty for far too long, her cheeks hollow despite her efforts to appear strong for her daughter. Eric's throat constricted as he looked between them. Behind Sandra and Michelle, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, wind howling through the pine trees like the voices of all the ghosts he'd tried to leave behind. Lightning illuminated the dark clouds that had settled over the peaks like a shroud, and thunder rolled across the valleys with ominous finality. He knew he should say no, should close the door and return to his carefully ordered existence, should protect himself from the inevitable pain that came with caring about other people. But something in the child's expression, something in the way Sandra held herself with dignity, despite her obvious desperation, made the words stick in his throat like pine sap. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken need and fear. Michelle's lower lip began to tremble, not from the cold, but from the growing realization that perhaps this stranger would turn them away like all the others had. Sandra's hand moved protectively to her daughter's shoulder, preparing to shield her from another rejection. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Eric's mind raced back to the events that had brought them to his door, remembering how it had all begun just 3 weeks earlier when he'd first encountered them in the valley town of Cedar Ridge. He'd gone down for his monthly supplies, a journey he made reluctantly and completed as quickly as possible. The townspeople knew him as the hermit from the mountain, the strange man who lived alone and spoke to no one unless absolutely necessary. He'd been loading salt and flour into his pack when he'd first seen Sandra Adams arguing with the bank manager outside the imposing brick building that dominated the town square. Even from a distance, he could see the desperation in her posture, the way she clutched a handful of papers to her chest as if they contained her very life. The banker, a portly man named George Brown, stood with his arms crossed, his face set in the kind of cold indifference that Eric had come to associate with men who measured worth only in dollars and cents. Michelle had been sitting on the wooden steps nearby, her small frame hunched over the cloth doll, whispering to it in the way children do when they're trying to make sense of an adult world that has suddenly turned hostile. Eric had paused in his packing, something about the scene pulling at memories he'd tried to bury. The child's posture reminded him of another little girl, long ago, who had sat in similar circumstances while her world crumbled around her. "Mrs. Adams," George Brown had said, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "I've been more than patient with you. Your husband's debts don't disappear just because he's dead. The bank has obligations to its shareholders." Sandra's voice had been steady despite the tremor Eric could see in her hands. "Mr. Brown, I'm not asking you to forgive the debt. I'm asking for time. The harvest from our small plot should cover at least half of what's owed, and I can take in washing and mending to earn the rest. The property is worth more to us than your promises," Brown had replied with brutal efficiency. "You have until the end of the month to vacate. That's 3 weeks, which is more generous than the law requires." Eric had watched Sandra's shoulders sag, as if the weight of the world had suddenly doubled. Michelle had looked up from her doll, sensing her mother's distress with the intuitive awareness that children possess. The little girl had risen and moved to Sandra's side, slipping her small hand into her mother's larger one without a word. "Where are we supposed to go?" Sandra had asked, and Eric had heard the crack in her voice despite her efforts to maintain composure. "That's not the bank's concern," Brown had said, already turning away. "Good day, Mrs. Adams." Eric had stood frozen by his pack, watching as Sandra knelt down to Michelle's level and whispered something that made the child nod solemnly. They had walked away together, hand in hand, their few possessions bundled in a canvas sack that Sandra carried over her shoulder. Something about their dignity in the face of such callous treatment had stirred something in Eric's chest that he'd thought long dead. He'd finished his business quickly and headed back up the mountain. But the image of the woman and child had followed him like smoke from a green fire. That night, as he sat by his own hearth listening to the wind in the pines, he'd found himself wondering where they would go, what they would do. He told himself it wasn't his concern, that he'd learned long ago that getting involved in other people's troubles only led to heartache. But sleep had eluded him, and when it finally came, it brought dreams of another woman and another child who had needed help that never came. 2 weeks had passed before he saw them again. This time, he'd gone to town specifically to check on their situation, though he'd told himself he was simply curious. What he'd found had made his blood run cold. Sandra and Michelle had been staying in the church basement, surviving on charity meals and the kindness of a few townspeople who could spare a coin or a crust of bread. Joshua White, the town sheriff, had been talking to Reverend Stephen Roberts outside the church when Eric arrived. Their voices had carried in the still morning air, and Eric had lingered near the cemetery to listen without being seen. "I don't like it any more than you do, Reverend," Joshua had been saying, but Mrs. Adams can't stay here indefinitely. The church board is getting complaints from some of the more prominent families. They say it sets a bad precedent. Reverend Roberts had shaken his head sadly. "She's a good woman, Joshua. Lost her husband to consumption, and now she's lost her home. Where's the Christian charity in turning her out?" "I'm not saying it's right," Joshua had replied, "but you know how it is. The Hendersons and the Washingtons donate most of the money that keeps this church running. If they withdraw their support because they disapprove of harboring vagrants—" "Vagrants?" The Reverend's voice had risen in indignation. "Sandra Adams is no vagrant. She's a member of this community who's fallen on hard times. You know what I mean, Stephen. Look, I'll talk to some of the neighboring towns, see if anyone needs domestic help. Maybe we can find her a position somewhere." Eric had heard enough. He'd slipped away from the cemetery and made his way to the general store, his mind churning with possibilities he wasn't ready to acknowledge. The storekeeper, an elderly man named Justin Sanchez, had greeted him with the cautious politeness reserved for the mountain hermit. "Afternoon, Eric. The usual supplies?" "Yes," Eric had replied, then hesitated. "The woman and child staying at the church, what's their story?" Justin had looked surprised at the question. Eric rarely showed interest in town gossip or affairs. Sandra Adams and her little girl Michelle. Sad case, really. Husband died of lung fever last spring, left them with nothing but debts. Bank foreclosed on their place last month. They've been making do on charity, but it can't last much longer. "What kind of debts?" "Medical bills mostly. Poor fellow was sick for months before he passed. Sandra spent everything trying to save him, even borrowed against the farm. Can't fault her for it, but it left them in a terrible situation." Eric had nodded and completed his purchases in silence, but his mind had been far from quiet. That night, he'd sat on his cabin's porch watching the stars emerge over the mountain peaks, wrestling with emotions he'd kept buried for years. The rational part of his mind insisted that their troubles weren't his responsibility, that he'd chosen this isolated life for good reasons. But another part of him, a part that remembered what it felt like to be helpless and alone, whispered that perhaps this was his chance to do what no one had done for him when he'd needed it most. The next morning had brought the first frost of the season, and with it, a clarity that surprised him. Eric had descended into town with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He'd found Sandra and Michelle outside the general store, where Sandra was carefully counting a few coins, while Michelle pressed her face to the window, staring longingly at a display of penny candy. "Mrs. Adams," he had said, approaching them carefully. His voice had been rusty from disuse, and he'd cleared his throat before continuing. "I wonder if I might have a word with you." Sandra had looked up, startled. She'd recognized him as the mountain man, who occasionally came to town, but they'd never spoken. Her hand had moved instinctively to Michelle's shoulder, drawing the child closer. Yes? Eric had struggled to find the right words. I understand you're in need of employment and lodging. I am, she'd replied cautiously. Do you know of something? I live alone on the mountain, he'd said, the words coming out more abruptly than he'd intended. It's a hard life, but there's work that needs doing. Cooking, mending, general housekeeping. I could offer room and board in exchange for help around the place. Sandra had studied his face carefully, weighing the offer against the desperation of her situation. What about my daughter? She'd be welcome too, Eric had said, surprised by how easily the words came. There's space enough for both of you. Michelle had looked up at him with those dark, serious eyes, and Eric had felt something shift in his chest. Do you have any toys? She'd asked with the directness that only children possess. Michelle, Sandra had chided gently, but Eric had found himself almost smiling. No toys, he'd admitted, but there are chipmunks and deer, and in the spring, there are wildflowers everywhere. The child had considered this seriously. Mama, can we see the chipmunks? Sandra had looked between her daughter and Eric, clearly torn between hope and caution. Mr. Thomas, Eric Thomas. Mr. Thomas, I appreciate the offer, but I should be honest with you. I have no money to contribute, and my daughter and I come as a package. If that arrangement doesn't suit you, it suits me fine, Eric had said, and meant it. When can you be ready to leave? We're ready now, Sandra had replied with a bitter laugh. All our worldly possessions fit in one bag. And so they'd begun the trek up the mountain together, Eric leading the way on paths he'd worn smooth over 8 years of solitude. Sandra had proved to be stronger than her delicate appearance suggested, keeping pace without complaint even as the trail grew steep and treacherous. Michelle had chattered constantly at first, excited by the adventure and the promise of seeing wild animals. But as the day wore on and the climb became more demanding, she'd grown quiet and tired. When she'd stumbled for the third time, Eric had stopped and knelt down to her level. Would you like me to carry you for a while? Michelle had nodded gratefully, and Eric had lifted her onto his shoulders without thinking. The feel of small arms around his neck had been so foreign and yet so achingly familiar that he'd had to stop for a moment to steady himself. Sandra had watched the exchange with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and wariness. They'd reached the cabin just as the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to stretch on forever. Eric had set Michelle down and watched as both mother and daughter took in their new home. The cabin was solid and well built, with a stone chimney and windows that faced east to catch the morning light. It wasn't large, but it was clean and weatherproof, with a small garden plot and a shed for storing supplies. It's beautiful, Sandra had said softly, and Eric had felt an unexpected warmth at her approval. That first night had been awkward for all of them. Eric had given Sandra and Michelle his own bedroom and made himself a bed on the floor near the fireplace. He'd lain awake listening to their quiet voices through the thin wooden wall, Sandra reading to Michelle from a worn book of fairy tales. The sound had stirred memories he'd tried to forget, of another voice reading the same stories to another child in another time. The next few days had established a routine of sorts. Sandra had proved to be an excellent cook and housekeeper, transforming the cabin from a bachelor's rough shelter into something approaching a real home. She'd mended his clothes with skill that spoke of years of practice, and she'd organized his supplies with an efficiency that impressed him. Michelle had explored every inch of the property, delighting in the discovery of a family of chipmunks that lived in the woodpile and a deer trail that passed close to the cabin each evening. But it had been clear from the beginning that this arrangement with Troy was temporary in Sandra's mind. She'd spoken often of finding permanent employment in one of the larger towns, of building a new life for herself and Michelle somewhere far from the memories that haunted Cedar Ridge. Eric had listened to these plans with a growing sense of dread that he'd refused to acknowledge, telling himself that he'd known from the start that they would leave eventually. It had been during their second week on the mountain that the first real crisis had occurred. Michelle had developed a fever that had started mild but quickly worsened, leaving her listless and burning with heat that no amount of cool cloths could touch. Sandra had paced the cabin like a caged animal, her medical knowledge limited to the home remedies that had failed to save her husband. "She needs a doctor," Sandra had said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "The fever's too high. I've seen this before." Eric had looked at the child lying pale and still in the big bed, her breathing shallow and rapid. The nearest doctor was in Cedar Ridge, a full day's journey down the mountain under the best of conditions. With Michelle in her current state, the trip would be dangerous, if not impossible. "There's another way," he'd said quietly. "There's a woman who lives about 5 miles north of here, Janet Harris. She's got knowledge of healing herbs and such. The local tribes used to seek her out before they were driven off." Sandra had looked at him with desperate hope. "Can you take me to her?" "I'll go myself," Eric had said. "It'll be faster, and someone needs to stay with Michelle." He'd left immediately, following deer trails and old logging roads through terrain that would have been impassable for anyone less familiar with the mountain. Janet Harris had lived in a small cabin surrounded by carefully tended gardens of medicinal plants. She'd been a woman of perhaps 60 years, with steel gray hair and hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. When Eric had explained the situation, she'd gathered her supplies without hesitation. "Child's fever, you say? How long?" "3 days, getting worse." Could be any number of things. We'll need to see her to know for sure." The journey back had taken longer, as Janet had to navigate the rough terrain more carefully than Eric could alone. By the time they had reached the cabin, Michelle's condition had deteriorated further. She'd been delirious, calling for her father and speaking to people who weren't there. Janet had examined the child with gentle thoroughness, checking her pulse and breathing, looking at her eyes and feeling the heat of her skin. "It's lung fever," she'd pronounced finally. "Same thing that took her father, most likely. But we caught it earlier this time." She'd brewed a tea from herbs Eric couldn't identify, adding honey to make it palatable for a child. "This will help break the fever," she'd explained to Sandra. "But she'll need careful watching for the next few days. The crisis usually comes on the 4th or 5th day." Sandra had nodded, her face pale but determined. "What can I do?" "Keep her cool but not cold. Make her drink as much of this tea as you can get into her. And pray, if you're the praying sort." Janet had stayed through the night, monitoring Michelle's condition and adjusting her treatment as needed. Eric had watched the two women work together, struck by Sandra's fierce devotion to her daughter and Janet's calm competence. When Janet had finally declared the crisis past, Sandra had wept with relief. "How can I ever thank you?" Sandra had asked. "No need for thanks," Janet had replied. "Eric here did me a good turn once. Consider it payment on an old debt." After Janet had left, Eric had found himself alone with Sandra for the first time since they'd arrived at the cabin. Michelle was sleeping peacefully, her fever finally broken, and the tension that had gripped them all for days was beginning to ease. "She said you'd done her a good turn," Sandra had said quietly. "What did she mean?" Eric had been silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Her grandson got lost in a blizzard 3 winters ago. I found him and brought him home. Nearly died doing it, but the boy lived." "You saved a child's life." "I did what anyone would have done." "No," Sandra had said firmly. "You did what a good man would have done. There's a difference." Her words had hung in the air between them, and Eric had felt something crack in the walls he'd built around his heart. He'd excused himself and spent the night outside, sitting on the porch and wrestling with emotions he'd thought long dead. The next morning had brought a change in their relationship that was subtle but unmistakable. Sandra had looked at him differently, with a warmth that went beyond mere gratitude. Michelle, recovering quickly as children do, had begun following him around the property, asking endless questions about the plants and animals they encountered. Eric had found himself answering her questions with a patience that surprised him, even showing her how to whittle simple shapes from pine branches. "You're good with children," Sandra had observed one evening as they watched Michelle play with a wooden horse Eric had carved for her. "I had a daughter once," Eric had said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Sandra had looked at him with sudden understanding. "What happened to her?" "Fever, like Michelle had, but there was no Janet Harris to help us then." "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." But it hadn't felt like a long time ago. Watching Michelle laugh and play had brought back memories of another little girl who had filled his life with joy before the fever had taken her and her mother both. The pain was still sharp after all these years, but somehow it felt different now. Less like a wound that would never heal, and more like a scar that would always be tender, but no longer crippling. As autumn had deepened into early winter, their temporary arrangement had begun to feel more permanent. Sandra had stopped talking about finding work elsewhere, and Eric had found himself making small improvements to the cabin with an eye toward comfort rather than mere survival. He'd built shelves for Sandra's few books and carved a small chair that was just the right size for Michelle. He'd even begun planning additions to the cabin that would give them more space and privacy. But it had been Michelle who had finally forced the issue that had been building between them for weeks. She'd been helping Eric repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree when she'd suddenly looked up at him with those serious dark eyes and asked the question that had been in all their minds. "Eric, are you going to be my papa now?" The question had hit him like a physical blow. He'd frozen with the hammer still raised in his hand, staring down at the child who had somehow worked her way into his heart, despite all his efforts to remain detached. Behind him, he'd heard Sandra's sharp intake of breath as she'd overheard the question. "Michelle," Sandra had said quickly, "Eric isn't. We're not." But Michelle had pressed on with the relentless logic of childhood. "Mama, you said Papa went to heaven and couldn't come back. But Eric is here, and he takes care of us like Papa did. Doesn't that make him our Papa now?" Eric had set down the hammer carefully, his hands shaking slightly. The child's innocent question had cut through all the careful walls he'd built, all the rational reasons he'd given himself for keeping his distance. In that moment, he'd realized that he wanted nothing more than to say yes, to claim this woman and child as his own and build a real family with them. But fear had held him back. Fear of loss, fear of pain, fear of opening his heart only to have it broken again when they inevitably left him for a better life elsewhere. He'd mumbled something about needing to check on the horse and had fled to the barn, leaving Sandra to explain to Michelle why things weren't as simple as they seemed. That night after Michelle had gone to bed, Sandra had confronted him about his reaction. They'd stood on the cabin's porch under a sky brilliant with stars, the air crisp with the promise of snow. "She didn't mean to upset you," Sandra had said quietly. "She's just a child trying to make sense of her world." "I know that." "Do you? Because the way you ran off today suggests otherwise." Eric had been silent for a long moment, struggling with words that seemed inadequate to express the turmoil in his heart. "It's complicated." "No, it's not," Sandra had said with surprising firmness. "Either you care about us or you don't. Either you want us to stay or you want us to go. Michelle deserves to know where she stands." "And what about what you want?" Erica would ask. "You've made it clear this is temporary. You're planning to leave as soon as you can find something better." Sandra had looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Is that what you think? That I'm just using you until something better comes along? Aren't you?" "Eric Thomas, you are the most stubborn, blind man I've ever met," Sandra had said, but there had been affection in her voice alongside the exasperation. "Do you think I'd let my daughter get attached to you if I was planning to leave? Do you think I'd let myself get attached if I didn't see a future here?" Her words had hit him like a revelation. "You're attached?" "Of course I'm attached, you fool. I've been falling in love with you for weeks. Watching the way you are with Michelle, seeing the kindness you try so hard to hide. But I won't force myself on a man who doesn't want me, and I won't let my daughter's heart be broken by someone who sees her as a burden." Eric had stared at her in amazement. "You think I see Michelle as a burden? Don't you?" "Sandra, that little girl has brought more joy into my life than I've felt in 8 years. Watching her discover the world, hearing her laugh, seeing the way she looks at me like I'm something special, it terrifies me because I want it so much." "Then why did you run away today?" "Because I'm scared," Eric had admitted, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm scared of caring too much and losing everything again. I'm scared of not being good enough for either of you. I'm scared that if I let myself believe this could be real, something will happen to destroy it." Sandra had stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm scared too. Terrified, actually. But I'm more scared of letting fear rob us of something beautiful." They'd stood there in the starlight, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging between them like morning mist. Eric had reached out tentatively to touch her face, marveling at the softness of her skin and the way she leaned into his touch. "I lost a wife and daughter to fever 8 years ago," he'd said quietly. "It nearly destroyed me. I came to this mountain to get away from everything that could hurt me again. And now I think maybe I've been hiding from life instead of living it." Sandra had smiled then, the first truly joyful smile he'd seen from her since they'd met. "So what do we do about it?" Before Eric could answer, they'd been interrupted by a small voice from the doorway. "Mama? Eric, why are you crying?" They'd turned to see Michelle standing in the cabin doorway in her nightgown, her cloth doll clutched in her arms and her hair tousled from sleep. Sandra had quickly wiped her eyes and moved to comfort her daughter. "We're not crying, sweetheart. We're just talking." "But your eyes are leaky," Michelle had observed with the brutal honesty of childhood. Eric had found himself laughing despite the emotional intensity of the moment. "Sometimes grown-ups get leaky eyes when they're happy, Michelle." "Are you happy?" Eric had looked at Sandra, then back at the child who had somehow become the center of his world. "Yes, I think I am." "Good," Michelle had said with satisfaction. "Can I have some milk? I'm thirsty." The next few weeks had passed in a haze of careful courtship and growing intimacy. Eric and Sandra had begun to explore the possibility of a real relationship, moving slowly for Michelle's sake as much as their own. They'd taken walks together while Michelle played nearby, sharing stories of their past and dreams for the future. Eric had told Sandra about his first wife and daughter, about the guilt he'd carried for not being able to save them. Sandra had shared her own struggles, the long months of watching her husband waste away and the desperate poverty that had followed his death. "I used to think love was a luxury I couldn't afford," Sandra had confessed one evening as they sat by the fire. "Something for people who had the security to risk their hearts. And now? Now I think maybe love is what gives us the strength to face whatever comes." Michelle had adapted to the changing dynamic between the adults with the resilience that children possess. She'd begun calling Eric by his first name instead of the formal Mr. Thomas Sandra had insisted on initially, and she'd started including him in her bedtime prayers alongside her deceased father and her mother. The casual way she'd begun treating him as a permanent fixture in her life had both warmed Eric's heart and terrified him with its implications. It had been during the first real snowstorm of the season that everything had changed. The storm had blown in from the north with a fury that surprised even Eric, who'd lived on the mountain long enough to respect its moods. The wind had howled around the cabin like a living thing, and the snow had fallen so thick and fast that visibility had dropped to mere feet. They'd been snug enough inside the cabin, with plenty of firewood and food to last through even an extended storm. But on the second day, when the wind had finally died down enough for Eric to venture outside to check on the animals, he discovered tracks in the snow that had made his blood run cold. Wolves, a pack of them judging by the number of tracks, and they'd been circling the cabin during the night. Eric had followed the tracks far enough to confirm his fears. The pack was large, at least 6 animals, and they were hungry enough to be bold. The harsh winter had driven their usual prey deeper into the forest, and the scent of humans and livestock had drawn them down from the high country. Eric had returned to the cabin to find Sandra and Michelle playing a game with pebbles by the fire, their laughter filling the small space with warmth. The sight of them, so innocent and trusting, had made his chest tight with protective instincts he'd thought long buried. "Sandra," he'd said quietly, not wanting to alarm Michelle, "I need to speak with you outside for a moment." Something in his tone had alerted her to the seriousness of the situation. She'd told Michelle to continue her game and had followed him onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders against the cold. "What is it?" "Wolves," Eric had said simply. "A pack of them. They've been around the cabin during the night." Sandra's face had gone pale. "How many?" "6, maybe more. They're hungry and they're getting bold. We need to be very careful until they move on." "What do we do?" "We stay inside unless absolutely necessary. Keep the fire burning bright. Make noise if you have to go outside for any reason. And we hope they find easier prey elsewhere." But even as he'd said the words, Eric had known it wouldn't be that simple. The tracks had told a story of predators growing desperate, and desperate predators were dangerous in ways that went beyond mere hunger. He'd spent the rest of the day quietly preparing for the possibility of an attack, checking his rifle and making sure his ammunition was dry and accessible. That night, as they'd settled down to sleep, Michelle had asked the question that had been building in Eric's mind all day. Eric, will you sleep in here with us tonight? I heard scary noises outside. Eric had looked at Sandra, who'd nodded almost imperceptibly. Of course, he'd said, making a bed for himself on the floor beside the big bed where Sandra and Michelle slept. But sleep had been elusive for all of them. The wolves had begun howling just after midnight, their voices rising and falling in harmonies that spoke of ancient hungers and primal fears. Michelle had whimpered in her sleep, and Sandra had reached down to take Eric's hand in the darkness. Are we safe? She'd whispered. As long as we stay inside and keep the fire going. Yes. But even as he'd said it, Eric had heard something in the wolves' calls that worried him. They weren't moving on as he'd hoped. If anything, they seemed to be settling in for an extended siege. The next morning had brought a temporary reprieve. The howling had stopped, and when Eric had cautiously ventured outside to check the area around the cabin, he'd found no fresh tracks. But his relief had been short-lived. The wolves had simply moved their base of operations to a rocky outcropping about a quarter-mile from the cabin, close enough to keep watch, but far enough away to avoid direct confrontation. They're waiting for something, Eric had told Sandra when he'd returned to the cabin. Waiting for us to make a mistake or show weakness. How long will they wait? As long as it takes, or until they find easier prey. But Eric had known that easier prey was unlikely to present itself. The storm had driven most of the wildlife deeper into the forest, and the wolves were too hungry to be patient much longer. The crisis had come on the fourth night. Eric had been dozing fitfully by the fire when a sound had jerked him awake. At first he'd thought it was just the wind in the trees, but then he'd heard it again. Scratching. Something was scratching at the cabin walls, testing for weaknesses. Eric had risen silently and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. What he'd seen had made his heart race. The wolves had surrounded the cabin, their eyes gleaming in the firelight that leaked through the cracks around the door. They were no longer content to wait and watch. They were actively hunting. Sandra, he'd whispered urgently, wake up, but don't make any sudden movements. Sandra had come awake instantly, her mother's instincts alert to danger even in sleep. What is it? The wolves, they're here. Sandra had carefully lifted Michelle, who was still sleeping, and had moved to join Eric by the window. The child had stirred but hadn't awakened, exhausted by days of tension and fear. How many? Sandra had asked. I can see 5, but there are probably more. As if summoned by his words, another wolf had emerged from the shadows, this one larger than the others and clearly the pack's leader. It had approached the cabin door with a confidence that spoke of intelligence and desperation in equal measure. What do they want? Sandra had asked. Food, warmth, shelter from the cold. Eric had checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. They're not going to give up easily. The pack leader had begun to scratch at the door, its claws leaving deep gouges in the wood. The other wolves had joined in, some testing the walls while others had begun to dig at the foundation stones. The sound had been terrifying in its methodical persistence. Michelle had awakened then, her eyes wide with fear as she'd taken in the situation. Mama, what's happening? It's all right, sweetheart, Sandra had said, her voice steady despite the terror Eric could see in her eyes. Eric is going to keep us safe. The child had looked at Eric with absolute trust, and in that moment he'd felt the full weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. These weren't just any woman and child. They were his woman and child, his family, and he would die before he let anything happen to them. I need you both to get in the corner by the fireplace, Eric had said quietly. Take some blankets and stay low. If anything happens to me, there's a root cellar under the trap door by the stove. Hide there until help comes. Nothing's going to happen to you, Sandra had said fiercely. But if it does, it won't. The wolves had continued their assault on the cabin, growing bolder as they'd sensed the fear of their prey. One of them had managed to work its way partially under the cabin, and Eric had heard the ominous sound of claws on the floorboards beneath their feet. That had been the moment when Eric had realized that passive defense wouldn't be enough. The wolves were too hungry and too desperate to be deterred by walls and fire alone. He'd have to take the fight to them. "I'm going outside," he'd announced. "No, whoa, whoa." Sandra had grabbed his arm. "You can't leave us alone. I can't protect you from in here. The cabin won't hold them much longer." "Then we'll all go together." "Absolutely not. I won't risk Michelle. And I won't risk you." They'd stared at each other in the firelight, the sound of the wolves' assault growing louder around them. It had been Michelle who had broken the impasse. "Eric," she'd said in a small voice, "are you going to leave us like Papa did?" The question had hit Eric like a physical blow. He'd knelt down beside the child, taking her small hands in his larger ones. "Michelle, I'm not going anywhere. I promise you that. But sometimes papas have to do dangerous things to keep their families safe. Are you my papa now?" Eric had looked at Sandra, seeing his own emotions reflected in her eyes. In that moment, surrounded by danger and facing the possibility of death, the truth had become crystal clear. "Yes," he'd said simply. "If you'll have me, I'm your papa now." Michelle had thrown her arms around his neck, and Eric had felt something break open in his chest. All the walls he'd built, all the careful distance he'd maintained, had crumbled in the face of a child's simple acceptance. "I love you, Papa," Michelle had whispered against his ear. "I love you too, little one. And I love your mama. That's why I have to go out there." Sandra had been crying openly now, but she'd nodded her understanding. "Come back to us." "I will, I promise." Eric had kissed them both, tasting salt tears and breathing in the scent of the two people who had become his entire world. Then he'd taken his rifle and stepped out into the night to face the wolves. The cold had hit him like a slap, but Eric had barely noticed it. His entire focus had been on the pack of predators that had surrounded his home. The pack leader had turned to face him, its lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed teeth like ivory daggers. For a moment, man and wolf had stared at each other across the snow-covered clearing, each taking the measure of the other. Then the wolf had charged. Eric's first shot had taken the pack leader in the chest, dropping it instantly. But the sound of the gunshot had only enraged the other wolves, and they'd come at him from all sides. Eric had worked the rifle's action with practiced efficiency, dropping two more wolves before the rest had reached him. The next few minutes had been a blur of snapping teeth and desperate struggles. Eric had used the rifle as a club when there hadn't been time to reload, fighting with a ferocity born of love and desperation. One wolf had managed to clamp its jaws on his arm, and Eric had felt the sharp pain of teeth piercing flesh. But he'd fought on, driven by the knowledge that Sandra and Michelle were depending on him. When the last wolf had fallen, Eric had stood alone in the clearing, breathing hard and bleeding from several wounds. The silence had been deafening after the chaos of battle. He'd looked back at the cabin to see Sandra and Michelle watching from the window, their faces pale with fear and relief. "It's over," he'd called to them. "They're gone." Sandra had rushed outside, Michelle close behind her, and they'd both thrown themselves into his arms despite the blood and the cold. Eric had held them close, feeling their warmth and their tears and their overwhelming relief. "I thought we'd lost you," Sandra had whispered against his chest. "Never," Eric had replied. "I told you I'd come back." Michelle had pulled back to look at him, her dark eyes serious. "Papa, you're hurt." "Just a little. Nothing that won't heal." "Good," she'd said with satisfaction, "because papas are not allowed to die. I already told God that." Eric had laughed despite the pain in his arm, amazed by the child's simple faith. "Well, if you told God, then I guess I'm stuck with you forever." "Promise?" "I promise." They'd gone back inside the cabin, and Sandra had tended to Eric's wounds while Michelle had helped by holding bandages and offering a steady stream of chatter about how brave her new papa was. The wolf bites had been painful but not serious, and Sandra's gentle ministrations had been as healing as any medicine. "We need to talk," Sandra had said once Michelle had fallen asleep, exhausted by the night's events. "About what?" "About what you said out there, about being Michelle's papa, about loving me." Eric had looked at her across the firelight, seeing the uncertainty in her eyes despite everything they'd been through. "Do you doubt it?" "No, but I need to know if you meant it, or if it was just something you said in the heat of the moment. Eric had reached for her hands, pulling her closer to him on the rough wooden bench where they sat. Sandra, I've never meant anything more in my life. I love you. I love Michelle. I want to spend the rest of my life taking care of both of you, if you'll let me. And if I said yes, what then? Then we become a family, really and truly. We build a life together on this mountain, and we face whatever comes as a unit. Sandra had been quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the firelight. It won't be easy. Michelle isn't your blood, and people will talk. Let them talk. She's mine now in every way that matters. And what about more children? Do you want more children? Eric had felt his breath catch. The possibility of more children, of babies that carried both his features and Sandra's, had been something he'd barely dared to hope for. Do you? I'd like Michelle to have brothers and sisters, and I'd like to give you children of your own blood. Any child we have together will be my own blood, Eric had said firmly, just like Michelle is now. Sandra had smiled then, the radiant smile that had become his favorite sight in all the world. In that case, Eric Thomas, I believe I'd like to marry you. Is that a proposal? I believe it is. Eric had kissed her then, long and deep, tasting the promise of their future in her lips. When they'd finally broken apart, they'd been both laughing and crying at the same time. When? Oh, Eric had asked. Spring, when the snows melt and we can get to town for a proper ceremony. That's months away. Good things are worth waiting for. But even as she'd said it, Sandra had moved closer to him on the bench, and Eric had known that the waiting would be sweet. Torture. The winter had passed in a haze of planning and preparation. Eric had begun construction on an addition to the cabin that would give them more space for their growing family. Sandra had spent hours sewing and mending, preparing clothes and linens for their new life together. Michelle had helped with everything, her excitement about having a real papa infectious and delightful. They'd made the journey down to Cedar Ridge in early spring to arrange for their wedding, and the reception they'd received had been mixed. Some of the townspeople had been genuinely happy for Sandra, glad to see her find security and love after so much hardship. Others had been less enthusiastic, whispering about the impropriety of a widow marrying so soon into such an unconventional man. But Eric and Sandra had ignored the gossips, focused only on each other and their plans for the future. They'd been married on a warm day in May, with Michelle serving as their only attendant and Reverend Roberts performing the ceremony. The little church had been half empty, but those who had come had wished them well with genuine warmth. Michelle had been the star of the ceremony, dressed in a new white dress that Sandra had sewn specially for the occasion. When Reverend Roberts had asked if anyone objected to the union, Michelle had piped up with, "I object to waiting any longer," which had brought laughter from the small congregation and tears of joy from both bride and groom. After the ceremony, they'd return to the mountain as a family, ready to begin their new life together. Eric had carried Sandra over the threshold of their expanded cabin, with Michelle dancing around them in excitement. The cabin had been transformed during the winter months, with new rooms and windows that filled the space with light and warmth. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thomas," Eric had said as he'd set Sandra down in their new parlor. "Welcome home, Mr. Thomas," she'd replied, and the words had felt like a benediction. That night, as they'd lain together in their marriage bed with Michelle sleeping peacefully in her new room next door, Sandra had turned to Eric with a smile that had made his heart race. "I have something to tell you," she'd said softly. "What's that?" "I think we may be having our first child sooner than we expected." Eric had stared at her in amazement. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be. Are you happy?" Happy had been too small a word for what Eric had felt in that moment. He'd pulled Sandra close and held her tight, marveling at the miracle of new life growing within her. After so many years of loneliness and loss, he'd been blessed with not just one family, but the promise of an even larger one. "I'm more than happy," he'd whispered against her hair. "I'm grateful. For you, for Michelle, for this baby, for everything." "Even for the wolves?" Eric had laughed softly. "Even for the wolves, if they hadn't come, I might never have found the courage to tell you how I felt." "Oh, you would have eventually. I'm very persuasive when I set my mind to something. Is that so? Absolutely. How do you think I convinced you to marry me? I thought I was the one who proposed. You poor, deluded man, Sandra had said with mock pity. I had you wrapped around my little finger from the moment we arrived at your cabin. Eric had considered this, thinking back to those first awkward days when he'd been so determined to keep his distance. You know, you might be right about that. Of course I'm right. I'm always right. You might as well learn that now. They'd made love then, slowly and tenderly, celebrating their union and the new life they'd created together. Afterward, as Sandra had dozed in his arms, Eric had lain awake listening to the sounds of the mountain night. But instead of the loneliness that had once filled those hours, he'd heard only peace and contentment. The months that had followed had been the happiest of Eric's life. Michelle had blossomed under the security of having a real family, her laughter filling the cabin and the surrounding forest with joy. Sandra had grown round with their child, her face glowing with health and happiness. Eric had thrown himself into the work of providing for his expanding family, hunting and trapping, with renewed purpose. When their son had been born on a crisp October morning, Eric had held the tiny, red-faced infant and wept with joy. The baby had been perfect in every way, with Sandra's delicate features and Eric's strong hands. Michelle had been fascinated by her new brother, insisting on helping with every aspect of his care. What should we name him? Sandra had asked as they'd sat together by the fire, the baby nursing contentedly at her breast. What do you think, Michelle? Eric had asked. He's your brother too. Michelle had considered this seriously, her small face scrunched in concentration. I think he looks like a Joshua, like Sheriff Joshua, but littler. Joshua it is then, Sandra had agreed, and Eric had nodded his approval. Little Joshua had thrived in the mountain air, growing strong and healthy under the devoted care of his family. As winter had settled over the peaks once again, Eric had found himself marveling at how different this season felt from all the others he'd spent alone. The cabin had been filled with warmth and laughter, with the sounds of family life that had once seemed like impossible dreams. One evening, as they'd sat around the fire with Michelle reading to baby Joshua and Sandra mending clothes in the lamplight, Eric had realized that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all those years ago when he'd fled to the mountain. He'd thought he'd been looking for solitude and peace, but what he'd really needed was love and family and the chance to be part of something larger than himself. What are you thinking about? Sandra had asked, noticing his contemplative mood. Just grateful, Eric had replied. For all of this, for all of you. Michelle had looked up from her book. Papa, do you remember when I asked you to be our papa and you got all scared? I remember. I'm glad you said yes. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. As the years had passed, their family had continued to grow. Sandra had given birth to 2 more children, a daughter they'd named Sarah, and another son they'd called Michael. The cabin had expanded to accommodate them all, becoming a true homestead rather than a hermit's retreat. Michelle had grown into a beautiful young woman, wise beyond her years and devoted to her younger siblings. She'd never forgotten that Eric had chosen to be her father rather than simply accepting the role by blood, and their bond had remained special throughout her childhood. When suitors had begun to call, Eric had found himself fiercely protective, determined that no man would be worthy of his eldest daughter unless he could prove himself capable of the kind of love Eric had learned to give. Joshua had grown into a sturdy boy who loved the mountain as much as his father did, learning to hunt and trap and read the signs of weather and season. Sarah had inherited her mother's gentle nature and her father's determination, becoming the peacemaker among the siblings. Little Michael had been the adventurer, always exploring and questioning and pushing the boundaries of what was safe and sensible. Through it all, Eric and Sandra's love had only grown stronger. They'd faced challenges together, from harsh winters to difficult harvests to the occasional visit from wild animals. But they'd met each obstacle as a team, drawing strength from their partnership and their shared commitment to their family. Now, standing in the doorway of their cabin on this rainy autumn evening, Eric reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The scared, lonely man who had once lived in isolation on this mountain was gone, replaced by a husband and father who understood that true strength came not from standing alone, but from standing together with those you loved. Michelle, now a young woman of 16, still lived at home, but was beginning to talk about her own future. Joshua, at 10, was already showing signs of the man he would become. Sarah, 8 years old, was the family's little mother, always caring for others. And Michael, just 5, was their wild child, full of energy and mischief. "Papa," Michelle said, bringing him back to the present moment, "you never answered my question." Eric looked down at her, this child who had changed his life with a simple request, and felt his heart swell with love and pride. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes, I will be your papa. I already am." Michelle's smile lit up the cabin like sunrise, and she threw her arms around his waist in a fierce hug. "I knew you would say yes eventually. You just needed time to figure it out." Sandra laughed from where she stood stirring the soup. "Your daughter has always been too smart for her own good." "Our daughter," our daughter, Eric corrected, and the words felt as natural as breathing. As the evening wore on and the storm continued to rage outside, the Thomas family gathered around their dinner table, sharing the simple meal Sandra had prepared and the complex love that bound them together. Eric looked around at their faces in the lamplight, each one precious beyond measure, and marveled at the path that had led him here. He thought about the man he'd been before Sandra and Michelle had arrived at his door, cold and scared and desperate for shelter. That man had been so afraid of being hurt again that he'd been willing to live half a life, existing rather than truly living. But love, Eric had learned, required courage. It required the willingness to risk everything for the chance at something beautiful and real. "Tell us a story, Papa," Sarah requested, as she did most evenings after dinner. "What kind of story?" Eric asked, though he already knew what she would say. "Tell us about the wolves," Michael chimed in, his eyes bright with excitement. "Tell us about how you fought them to protect us." It had become a family legend, the story of the night Eric had faced down a pack of wolves to protect his new family. The children never tired of hearing it, and Eric never tired of telling it, though he always emphasized the parts about courage and love rather than the violence. "Well," Eric began, settling back in his chair, "it was a night much like this one, with snow falling and wind howling around the cabin." As he told the familiar story, Eric watched his family's faces, seeing wonder and pride and love reflected there. When he reached the part about promising Michelle that he would be her papa, he saw tears in Sandra's eyes, just as there were every time he told this story. "And that," Eric concluded, "is how I learned that sometimes the most important battles we fight aren't against wolves or storms or any outside enemy. Sometimes they're against our own fears, our own doubts about whether we're worthy of love and family." "But you won," Michelle said softly. "We all won," Eric replied, "because we chose love over fear. We chose to be brave enough to build something beautiful together." Later that night, after the children had been tucked into their beds and Sandra had fallen asleep beside him, Eric lay awake listening to the sounds of his family sleeping peacefully around him. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a crisp, clear night filled with stars. He thought about the question Michelle had asked him in the doorway, the question that had terrified him and transformed him in equal measure. "Will you be our papa?" Such simple words, but they had contained the power to change everything, to turn a hermit into a father and a broken man into someone whole. Eric smiled in the darkness, remembering his initial panic at the child's innocent request. He'd thought she was asking him to replace her father, to step into shoes that could never be filled. But what she'd really been asking was much simpler and much more profound. She'd been asking him to love her, to choose her, to make her part of his heart and his life. And in the end, that choice had saved them all. It had given Michelle and Sandra the security and love they'd needed. But it had also given Eric something he had thought lost forever, the chance to be part of his family again, to love and be loved in return. The mountain wind whispered through the pine trees outside their cabin, but it no longer sounded lonely to Eric's ears. Instead, it sounded like a lullaby, like nature itself singing his family to sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but they would face them together, as they had everything else. Eric closed his eyes and let himself drift towards sleep, surrounded by the warmth of his wife and the soft breathing of his children. In a few hours, he would wake to the sound of Michelle helping Sandra prepare breakfast while the younger children played nearby. He would step outside to check on the animals, and breathe in the crisp mountain air. Grateful for another day in this life he'd never dared to dream possible. But for now, he simply held Sandra close and listened to the peaceful sounds of home, knowing that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with leaving everything behind, but with finding the courage to let love in. The scared, lonely man who had once lived in isolation on this mountain was gone forever, replaced by a husband and father who understood that true strength came not from standing alone, but from choosing to stand together with those you love, no matter what storms might come.